Well, welcome to the 2021 Land Lab lecture series. As I think many of you know, I'm leading an inaugural studio this spring that frames a UVA satellite site, Milton Airfield, as a mesocosm for ways of knowing through situated making, where students research, design, and build a mesocosm investigation to then challenge, interrogate, and potentially reorient through a series of exercises, exploring alternative ways of knowing and creating knowledge. And then in tandem to this studio is this lecture series, which is a parallel effort in positioning the studio's efforts on site within history of precedents and theory and practice. And this evening we're joined by Brian Osborn. I'm sure you can see him in maybe the top left corner here. Brian is an architect and a landscape architect. His research interests hover around topics of building, site, and landscape technologies and the way that we engage them as designers through drawing and expanding modes of representation. And his contributions to this sort of evolving field of computational techniques in landscape architecture can be found in publications including Landscape Architecture and Digital Technologies, Codify, Parametric and Computational Design in Landscape Architecture. One of the editors, of course, is Brad Cantrell, chair of the program here, and Representing Landscapes, Hybrid. And Brian is currently an associate professor of architecture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Previously, he has taught at Rutgers University, Pratt, as well as UVA here, where he was the 2012 to 2014 Virginia Teaching Fellow before continuing on as an assistant professor in the Landscape Architecture Department. And if I'm not mistaken, he also taught a studio at Milton. Is that correct, Brian?
I did, yeah, a couple of years, and I can show some work from that.
I'm curious to see that. Well, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Brian Osborn.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I'm excited about your syllabus that you sent me, Matthew, and that you guys are working at Milton, and super pleased to be back and participating in some small way in that work. So thanks for having me. Yeah, so I sent this sort of lecture synopsis to Matthew a couple of weeks ago, and I think it still holds true as a description of the lecture. So I can sort of start here. What we know about a site is the result of our capacity to see and measure it, yet much of what occurs on a site does so while we aren't looking. So I guess what I mean by this, on one hand, is that, as you guys maybe are becoming familiar, the processes that are kind of always at work in forming a site, the biophysical processes, I mean, often occur slowly, or at least are not evident to the human eye, who may or may not be paying attention. On the other hand, what I mean in saying that we aren't looking is also that I guess I'm making the case that our traditional disciplinary methods of seeing, measuring, and drawing sites are not really set up to capture that kind of instability or dynamism that is characteristic of sites and of landscapes. So I think that in a kind of unlikely turn of events, computation has enabled new forms of situatedness for landscape architects. And I want to use that word, on one hand, to try to connect to Matthew's syllabus, but also to connect to people like Jane Rendell, who run the Situated Practices program at the Bartlett, and has written about the role of site specificity in terms of responding to both place and time in art practice, and how that might inform new modes of practice in the built environment. So, something as abstract as computation may seem at first to be at odds with an interest in site specificity. I think that many contemporary methods allow for direct linkages between sites and their biophysical processes, and drawing and modeling, which is where the kind of design of landscape often takes place. So this is where the idea of live drawing comes in. So I just want to kind of set this idea up a bit by showing you some early explorations that were done at UVA and at Milton. And then I'd like to show you something that I'm working on now, which is very much in process, and therefore I may sort of trail off in my ability to describe it clearly, but it's also kind of open for your feedback. And so I hope hope that I encourage you to do that. So also, some of what I'll talk about today, you can also find in, as Matthew mentioned, in Codify, this collection that Brad Cantrell put together. I'm not going, if you're familiar with that, I apologize a little. I won't be verbatim to it, but certainly some of it is there. And if you have any interest, you could sort of find it there. I don't know what Brad is doing also to kind of drive up the cost of this book, but it sure is working, whatever means he's using. One of the things I think that is in that essay and that I want to pick up on here are these images, or this book called The Climate Near the Ground by Rudolf Geiger. I think the book is produced, I think it's a really beautiful book, and if you aren't familiar with it, I suggest you get a copy. And if you're nostalgic about sort of drawings and artifacts, I suggest you get the oldest copy that you can get your hands on. I think that my copy is from 1950, but it was published in 1927. By the way, I'm almost certain that Lucia Finney pointed this book out to me and left it on my desk, and so I'm forever grateful for her doing that. So if you want to talk about The Climate Near the Ground, you might bother her. I think what's so amazing about this book, or one of the things, is that it's the first, or at least one of the first books on a new subject, when this was written in 1927, of what Rudolf Geiger referred to as microclimatology. And in the preface, Geiger explains the need for, or tries to make a case for, the relevance for the book. And even though it's a kind of scientific study, his reasoning is kind of wonderfully polemical. He says that up until that time, meteorology and the study of climate in general began at a height of 2 meters above the ground. And this is because, and so nobody in the subject was interested in what happened below that point. And this is because the ground kind of caused so much disturbance in the kind of reading, in their instrumentation and their reading of the measurements of climate, that it couldn't be reliable, or was thought to not be reliable. So the ground was interfering, and I think in that way, has agency over things like climate. So of course, the reason for the study, to study climate at all, especially at that time, was to predict conditions for agriculture and things of the like, which of course, agriculture exists within the first. Sorry about that. I'm getting a delivery of gravel to my driveway right at this moment, which is unfortunate timing, but that's what's happening. So obviously there were some problems with the kind of, with the data and with the predictions they were getting in their studies. So the title is extremely straightforward then, The Climate Near the Ground. And Geiger describes it as a survey of microclimatological conditions within the first 2 meters. And it's made up of 180 or so drawings, like the ones that are cycling here. So I just want to kind of describe a couple in order to set things up. The image on the left, figure 27, is called Theoretically Calculated and Observed Temperature Stratification Over an Asphalt Street. So you can see that there's temperature on the x-axis in Celsius, and height in the y-axis. And so in a really kind of straightforward way, as you move up above the ground, the temperature decreases because the asphalt is re-radiating that heat back into the atmosphere. So this is a kind of really clear description of what Geiger was describing as that kind of disturbance. Excuse me. So maybe that gives us a good kind of didactic starting point, but it's also made up of what I think are kind of inventive drawings, like the one you see on the right, which is measuring the warming of a standing tree trunk on a cloudless April 1st on the Cantrell summit. So it's looking at the cardinal directions and measuring temperature as the day, as the tree trunk warms throughout the day. And there's, as I said, 180 of these. The kind of the sequencing of blooms on a plant throughout the day or throughout the season. On the right, kind of trying to preserve the book orientation, but the image is rotated 90 degrees, but it's looking at tree interception and the way that rain falls through various types of trees. So I think some of what's useful for me here is that some of these images are the result of new technology available at the time. You know, the ability to kind of measure temperature in a sequence and at varying heights above the ground. And then some of them are the product of just kind of being on site, kind of site engagement and sort of keeping watch. So that brings me to some of the work that I did at UVA and in the what we were calling the surveillance practices studio, which we started in 2014. I taught it 2 years, the fall of 2014 and the fall of 2015. And we were interested in seeing if we could develop ways of keeping watch in a really kind of straightforward way. So could we develop surveillance tactics that would allow us to continue to look at the site over time? I'm realizing that I got a little off track here, so give me 1 minute. I think also just to kind of add, I think maybe from Geiger, I think you could argue that we find ourselves in a similar moment, perhaps to what Geiger may have experienced in 1927, where we discover that our study, in this case of the landscape, is or has been ignoring some critical areas, especially the kind of dynamic behavior of sites over time. And I think especially when you think about landscape as a design profession, which is based, like architecture, on more remote forms of site engagement and largely through drawing, more so than you would if you thought about something like gardening, which you've heard Julian Raxworthy talk about. So partially I'm interested in how something like drawing that is so fundamental to the discipline might better enable work with dynamic materials and processes. So Geiger's drawings are influential for me in that way. And I've used the analogy of the survey. It's a kind of useful analogy for me, but the survey, if you think about it, measures and draws the physical conditions of a site. And for much of the discipline, the survey is the basis for design, where proposed constructions are made relative to that drawing. So, remove material from here to here, or add material from here to there, those types of responses to the survey. And in response to this, I've become interested in a shift away from surveying and towards something more like surveillance, which opposed to the kind of one-time visit to the site that you might find with a survey, is more about a long-term engagement with site and this ability to keep watch. And so that brings me to these surveillance practice studios at UVA in 2014 and 2015. We were interested in a really kind of straightforward way, as I mentioned before, finding ways to keep watch on site and to see what we might find if we did that. And the studios were really kind of built on this really simple sketch. This is a super messy sketch, but what's happening here is that there's a very simple sensor, a photo sensor. It's collecting light information, and that through Grasshopper is driving this graph, which is showing you time on the x-axis and light levels on the y-axis. And so, probably this is in a classroom or something, and I'm putting my hand over the sensor and removing it, and that's why you're getting variations. It also looks funny. It doesn't look like a smooth graph. It has kind of spikes and jumps, and that's just kind of the product of do-it-yourself sensors and the kind of interference that you get from them. But the kind of premise of the studio was, if I can make a drawing like this, which is communicating data in a kind of live feed from a sensor, then presumably over time I could develop more spatial drawings that could be used, for instance, as a kind of design in a design process. And what is, I think, helpful for me, just to sort of go back to the idea of drawing, is that the information from the site, the kind of sensor is embedded in the site, and the information that it's collecting is then brought directly into your design medium, or the Rhino and Grasshopper, the kind of traditional methods of design. So this should be familiar. I wanted to throw some good images of Milton in here. We started to develop as a group, each studio working as a group, we started to develop a sensor. It was a long-term project because there's a kind of steep learning curve, and also it's at once a fabrication problem and at the same time a kind of technical problem. And it also is tied to individual student research. So as a kind of group project, the sensor is trying to collect a range of information and is trying, through doing that, to represent each of the students. So the students were, I think actually this is a very small cohort. There were 6 students in this class. And each of them had an interest that they were developing in the studio through on-site engagement, and then also other forms of research and design work. And they were then, as part of this group work, trying to say, I need, for instance, light levels sensed on site, or I need wind sensed on site, and so forth. So this is the first year that we did this, and we tried to produce a kind of self-similar sensor that could be placed at a variety of the conditions at Milton. So here you have it in the emerging conifer forest, on the river edge, and in the kind of open field, which at the time was being used for the Remote Control Airplane Club. I think so. In the second year, our methods, we got smarter and wiser, and we had more people, so that meant that we could afford a more robust construction. And so, but the setup was the same. We were looking to make one sensor, which could then feed the design work of all of the students. We had this larger cohort. I'm kind of nostalgic for these moments, so I'm trying to gratuitously include them in this lecture. But the idea with this sensor was that it could be raised and lowered. We had, because of a larger student body, some of these students wanted information that was up in a canopy. Some of them wanted to know about, from a human perspective, about the head height. Others were more interested in the kind of ground level. And so we needed a sensor that could be deployed at all of these. And so we used this method, which is similar to a kind of tree trimming method, where we would throw a beanbag up into the tree so that we could hoist the sensor up into the tree. And so we have this version sort of hanging in the tree canopy, and at the same time, it worked on the left as something that could hover above the field and move from head height down to ground level. So I think you could think of the sensors, the making of the sensors, as a sort of background task. We worked on it maybe weekly, but it maybe wasn't the focus of our work. I guess it was at times, in moments where we had to get that work done. We kind of worked in a flurry on it. But most of the time it was a sort of background task and in support of some of the student work. And so I want to show you one of the student projects as a way of, because I think it describes the kind of all of the ideas that we were trying to get to. This is the work of Jenna Francis Harris in the fall of 2014. And Jenna, when she first started to go to Milton, became interested in detritus, or the kind of collections and patterns of leaves on site. And so she started to study the different kind of leaf litter patterns of different trees that she could find on site, or ones that were prevalent in the area. And so she did this research through a combination of data collection, or traditional sort of collecting research. By that I mean, the internet and library, but then also pairing that or trying to kind of field truth that with what we were calling direct measuring devices, which were meant to be really low tech, a kind of response to the high tech nature of the sensor, something that allowed us to get on site on day one and start to collect information. So Jenna started to put weed fabric down under some of the trees so that she could try to quantify how much leaf litter was being made. And if we go back to this chart that she produced, again, this is a kind of combination of that on-site measurement and what she could gather from botany books, but she's kind of looking at the form of the tree and the potential leaf litter pattern at the top. And then she's looking at the material of the leaf litter itself, which has a range of decomposition rates from fast to slow based on kind of density. And then she was also looking at abscission, or when the leaves would drop, what season, what time of year. And then the kind of at the bottom again is a sort of rate of decomposition study. So from there, she began trying to turn that material into a design project. And she did so by producing a kind of catalog, or what she called test plots, where she would imagine a circle on the site, and she would do a series of things that would affect the collection of leaf litter. So the image on the far left, she's cutting down trees at the trunk and laying them in a kind of parallel order to each other as a way of making a kind of wind block or a kind of dam in order to collect leaves. So she imagines that over time, as the result of wind pushing the leaves around, that the leaves would pile up along the edges of these logs, and all of those things would decompose over a period of time. I'm realizing that I wish that I had a much bigger view, so I'm just going to zoom in. And what she was really interested in was the production of soil, or the kind of production of soil that came from that. A part of her research was about, and I should say part of her polemic in the project was that when we look at a kind of soil study of an area or a geological study of an area, the geological study might happen over the kind of 100-year term, whereas a soil study might happen less than that, maybe a 20-year term. But she argued that soil gets made every day. And as a result of these processes of leaf litter and decomposition. Now I'm going to try to get back to where I was. So the on the bottom, oops, maybe I zoomed out too fast, but she was trying to imagine over time what she thought the production of new soil might be. And so that's how she evaluated each of the test plots, their ability to produce new soil, essentially. And that might provide a new kind of field that then she could work on in terms of program. So she produced a lot of these, some of them more effective than others, and then essentially arranged them on site. And I think this is a kind of place which is a problem in the work. I'll just kind of put that out there, something that maybe is a struggle, in that in the end, Jenna is proposing a kind of test site, like a big laboratory. And maybe I would argue like isn't making landscape program or isn't generating human program through that. But I am interested in the idea that something might begin as a kind of response to a landscape process and evolve into maybe a kind of novel program, rather than beginning as a human program and then sort of pushing the biological process to kind of form that program. So just to sort of get back to the on-site studies, because they were working through Grasshopper, and theoretically an important component of the class was this direct measuring, and the ability to go to Milton and experiment directly on the site became really important. and I haven't, this is maybe one of the most grandiose versions where a group of students, Luke Harris, Bonnie Kate Walker, and Hannah Barefoot, produced a kind of control burn. And again, they were working as 3 individuals. Each of them had a different interest, but decided as a group that understanding what a control burn did on the site was helpful for all of their research kind of agendas. Bonnie Kate on the right was directly interested in carbon processes on the site, and so fire made a kind of natural connection there. Hannah in the middle in the red shirt was interested in maintenance practices, not unlike what you might have heard from Michael Geffel. And Luke was interested in air, the kind of condition of the air. And I'll show you a little bit of some of those in a bit. But some of them were much less grandiose. This is similar to Jenna's collection of detritus. This is done by Sheila Yang, where again, she's trying to understand the material that drops from the tree. I think they start as one of the things that I'm interested in with these is that they start as really low tech and maybe kind of ad hoc and ugly. And they, over time, they become the first design move in a way. So I'm interested in the potential that these devices aren't just about research, aren't just about collection, but they become the beginning of a series of responses to the site, which you could think of as part of the design process. I don't know if Zihao Zhang is still there, but he was in this class as well. He was interested in sort of aspect, the direction of slopes and the severity of slopes and the relationship of that to thermal conditions on site. So he made a series of manipulations to the ground plane and was trying to understand what those manipulations did in terms of the thermal conditions. And then he, in Grasshopper, as you can see in the bottom, was trying to model projective versions of those things. So the on-site study was limited to what he could do with a shovel in a given period of time, whereas the Grasshopper study has the capability to be much more projective and to grow beyond his own limitations. Just trying to show you a kind of range of things. Clara Casteven was interested in exchanges between the body and the site and used thermal exchange as one of those things. So just looking at how the body sits on the site and that it leaves a kind of a trace of that exchange through a thermal connection. And then back to Luke Harris, I mentioned that he was interested in air. So he sort of framed a project that was about seeing the site as full rather than empty, or I'm sorry, seeing the air above the site as full rather than empty, and that it's full of kind of molecular matter. It's full of matter rather than being sort of clear and empty as we normally approach it, and that there are processes that give light to some of that matter. And so he was interested in both understanding those kind of airborne processes and ways that we could sort of draw them on site, like you're seeing here with the flares. So he would, I think that this will be a GIF. So he tried to develop these theoretical models for different kind of air processes. So on the left, you're looking at the trapping of air. So something that he found in the forest was that the flare kind of produced a body, or the product of the flare would kind of hover and sit below the canopy. So he then turned to research to understand what was happening. He determined that this was called trapping, and then he was able to kind of model that with the idea that maybe then you could control it through Grasshopper. The one on the right, I think he was calling diffusion, and it has to do with the air carrying the material away. So I think one thing that we were trying to get to in the studio is to reframe the material of landscape, or the the traditional materials of landscape, or more maybe like the assumed material of landscape in a new way. So this is the work of Bonnie Kate Walker, who you saw doing the control burn. She's saying that the carbon landscape is composed of the processes that catalyze flux or exchanges of carbon between biomass and atmosphere, and that by cultivating an experimental site of intensive management and sensing, we can affect localized changes in carbon flux, rates and spatial distribution, while creating an aesthetic experience of carbon and the data through which we understand it. And she thought that through this carbon landscape experience, we're able to visualize the intangible. She was understanding carbon as a hyperobject. And if we have a way to see and experience carbon in the landscape, then it might be possible to develop a cultural relationship to it. So clearly critical that we have none or have only a kind of one-way relationship to carbon. And so she produced drawing, I want to look at this one first, drawings like this, which tried to draw the field at Milton as a set of kind of latent carbon processes. So by kind of reframing the field, not as a series of green things, but as a series of possible carbon processes, that then she could determine ways of operating on that field that would either release or sequester that carbon. Okay, so that's really the sort of work that we were doing in the surveillance practices studio. If it's okay, I think we have time. I'd like to show you something that is ongoing. I know that Michael Geffel and Julian Raxworthy have been with you already. I've been working with them. We've been collaborating on a series of ideas, which we're calling veritic disturbance. The idea of the veritic, surely Julian Raxworthy told you about. And it's following Michael's work at the University of Oregon, where he's interested in maintenance tactics. And I think I'm gonna rely on him having shown you all that, and I'm just gonna sort of jump to my kind of role in that study. What you're seeing here is during one of his mows, but to point it out, there's a Robinia on the right in the foreground, black locust, and this is a kind of emergent tree. It is happening more or less naturally on the site. And as Michael probably told you, the reason for his work, the kind of cover, what gives cover to his work is this problem of blackberry on the site. That if left to go fallow, the site would turn into a kind of thicket of blackberry material. It would become, 12 feet high and would be impassable essentially. And so what we're trying to do is to use the idea that the university is interested in the control of blackberry as cover for something that might be more. And one thing that we're working on now is the relationship, I guess, between the Robinia and the blackberry. Through Michael's work, we've been able to observe that, I'm going to show you, this is the locust at a kind of younger stage. You can see here in the lower left, there's a kind of a few saplings of Robinia visible. Through Michael's work, we've been able to observe that when mowed, the blackberry, or when mowed a couple of times, the blackberry has a tendency to go prostrate. So like what you're seeing here. So I'm not sure exactly when this image was taken, but this is indicative of what happens to the blackberry after more than one mow, after at least 2 mows. It's gone prostrate. It's sort of like given up the interest in going vertical, it seems, and it has become more efficient maybe with its energy use and has decided to stay low, whereas the blackberry is less quick to make that adjustment and so continues to grow vertically. And so our thinking is that this is potentially a benefit to us, that we can mow for blackberry and try to kind of identify the emergence of Robinia, and then try to avoid it through Michael's maintenance practices in order to produce Robinia forests or kind of stands of Robinia. So we're working on a series of live drawings that do this. I think this is a kind of plan of a hypothetical Robinia stand, and I think I'm going to look at a more step-by-step series. But in the upper left, there's a kind of randomly distributed set of Robinia sapling, and this is only looking at the Robinia. The blackberry is not really drawn here. And so this is the first image. If you move to the right, that's the second image, and this is after one of Michael's mows, indicated by the gray strip. And the Robinia that are mowed or hit by the mower, that kind of through traumatic reiteration spawns more growth in the Robinia. And so you get two types of growth. You get a kind of tree growth at the cut site of the Robinia where it was mowed, and you also get a sapling. So in the image, the third image on the left, middle left, you're seeing the kind of sapling arriving. I'm going to zoom in. So the third image on the left, you're seeing a kind of sapling on top of the mown area, and then on the right, you're seeing a sucker which is shooting underground from the mown Robinia to form a new sapling. So through this kind of suckering, then we hope that we're able to kind of make, stands. I'm sorry that I'm botching this image here. Let's call it zoom problems. Okay, I'm just going to move it. There we go. So that in the end, after a certain number of mows, the locust would sort of shoot up vertically to produce a more of a tree form. And we imagine that at this point, mowing is no longer a suitable maintenance regime, and that we would move to something else, like in the way that an arborist would be more selectively pruning these trees. So from there, back to this plan, this starts to build in some of Michael's variations on the maintenance practices, what he calls a moire. So in a second mow, kind of reorienting the mow to a 15-degree difference so that you produce this moire, and then that kind of expands the number of conditions for the Robinia. You have a kind of mown once, mown twice, or mown not at all. So we produced that very recently for a publication. I think the next steps for us are to try to tie this to a kind of sensor or to make it live in a way. It's made in Grasshopper. It's open to liveness, I guess. We can adjust it, but we want to sort of tie it to Michael's site and his work with the drones. And so I guess I'm gonna show you the most new stuff, which is also the least baked, but begins with this idea of land cover. And I'm sure that you are familiar with the idea of land cover as a term used to describe the physical materials at the surface of the Earth. It's not a new technology. As early as the 30s, land cover was used as a way to understand the material at the surface of the Earth. Mostly done through a combination at first of aerial photography, large-scale aerial photography of an individual site taken from an airplane, and field truthing. So there was at first a kind of site specificity to it in a way. Over time, there's been an interest in being more universal with the way that we classify land cover. And so looking at this paper from Elaine Matthews in 1983, she's kind of, this is one of the early proposals of a universal classification system, where you can see in the blurry image on the right, her interest in looking at the globe and understanding the whole globe on one set or one classification system, so that the classification of land cover would be shared across continents, across disciplines, and that would be a way of understanding vegetation, loss of vegetation in some regards, and also maybe the potential for new vegetation, like in the way that a potential response to climate change is the production of forests. So a drawing like this one from the International Geosphere Biosphere Program might look for land that is covered in forest versus land that has the potential to be covered in forest. So we're interested in this idea of land cover, and again, seeing land cover as maybe a kind of traditional drawing method, and trying to see how we can reframe it in a way that suits us. And one of the ways that we're thinking about that is to think of what we're calling micro cover, to go back to a period where, or to go back to a method where you might look at a particular site or even a particular portion of a site to try to understand the kind of nuances of what might be happening in the dark green area, for instance, realizing that this is not the kind of homogeneous green zone that it might appear to, but that there's lots of subtlety within it, as Michael's work has revealed. And sort of pairing that with these more recent, the more recent use of drones and sensors also in agricultural industries. I'm just gonna, I'm worried that these are too small. So this is the University of Nebraska. They're interested in using multispectral imaging as a way of seeing early weed detection. So to look at the crop, the image that you're seeing on the lower right is a soybean crop. The red is weed product. The green is their soybean. I'm sorry, the green is bare earth, and the yellow is their soybean. So they're trying to be, the goal for them is quite pragmatic. They're interested in identifying where the clusters of weeds are so that they can apply herbicides in the appropriate location. But they've done an amazing job of, you know, sort of sharing their information and giving this what I call using drones in agriculture for dummies, maybe. But it gives us a good start. I think what's happening is that they're using multispectral imaging, this kind of red guy here, in order to take these near infrared images, in order to, the multispectral image, if you aren't familiar, is showing part of the portions of the spectrum of light that isn't visible to the human eye, but that can kind of distinguish between healthy and non-healthy plants, because healthy plants have much stronger reflectance in the near infrared region than unhealthy plants. So in a way, it's a kind of measure of photosynthesis. So our hope is to kind of think about this as a way of recoloring, maybe similar to the work that Bonnie Kate was doing, to reframe what we're drawing in the landscape from a series of plants, perhaps, to from a series of green things, perhaps, to a series of healthy or non-healthy, or to be able to differentiate between species within a field. So, for instance, to try to identify where the robinia is and where the blackberry is, so that we might tell the mower to avoid the blackberry. So we're starting to work with Michael's aerials to do this. Michael surely showed you this sequence of his field study from the early picture in May. Sorry, this is the first one in May of 2020, June and August, and then in October. And so we're wanting to kind of understand that sequence in terms of a multispectral image. And I have to tell you, so this is a kind of a sort of dry run or a test to see how we might use it. I don't want to kind of pretend that this is an actual multispectral image. All we're doing is kind of mapping the aerial. At the moment, Michael has a kind of an approved grant for a Michael's multispectral camera. And so we're like getting ready for it. We want to know what we're going to do with it when we get the information. But the idea is that we would tie that, like the other live drawings, tie that back into Grasshopper. And this is a super blurry image. This is literally where we are with this, but bringing the aerial in on the left, turning that into a kind of gridded field that we can evaluate on a cell-by-cell basis on the right. We're hoping that with the addition of the multispectral images that we can easily identify different plant species. So that's sort of where we're at with this. Yeah, again, I welcome your feedback, especially on this stuff that's still active and vulnerable to input.
Great, thank you, Brian. Any comments, questions, thoughts?
Hi. Thank you so much for that lecture. It was really exciting to see what you're up to. I guess I have kind of, I want to jump back maybe to a little bit earlier in the lecture. And I was a few minutes late, so let me know if you already covered this. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you think through the politics of surveillance and the role of the landscape architect, and you know, and kind of in what contexts and at what scales do you imagine this type of real-time data collection and surveying being advantageous, and you know, do you imagine it as what you're doing now sort of contributing to a body of research for individual land managers, or anyway, I'd just love to hear what you think about the role that landscape architects can play in that kind of knowledge production.
Yeah. It's a good question, a difficult question. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, in the beginning, while at UVA and while images like this one were being made, I was almost entirely concerned with the ability to kind of reframe landscape material to something which is much more dynamic than it is, or something that maybe operated on a scale that we didn't care about than it did. One of the things that comes up in Michael's work in the field that we happen to be working on at U of O is that it's a kind of public site, or it's in a very public location. So it's in downtown Eugene on the riverfront, and it happens to be the site. I mean, the issues of surveillance become really sort of tangled there, because it happens to be a site, because it's a bit fallow, happens to be a site where people are living, setting up encampments, and the university has a delicate relationship with that. They don't like directly ask people to leave, but they also are mowing in order so that the field stays flat and sort of unencumbered. We think, on one hand, this doesn't really answer the kind of difficult part of your question, but on one hand, we see the U of O's like allowance to do work on the site as I mentioned, the kind of cover, and that if we could start sensing on the site, and that those sensing objects had character to them, that we might be able to indicate that something was happening, like to kind of to show care, let's say, on the site. And when we think about them, I didn't show it today, it's very kind of sketchy in lots of pieces, but we have a sensor, not a drone, but a physical sensor, or a kind of land mounted sensor for the U of O site that's currently in production. And it's, we think of it like a scarecrow, like that it has character to it. We call it the kind of field watcher. It has a kind of hat, you know, And in that way, I think we're trying to be a bit cute about it, like a kind of an inanimate object which has characteristics like Wally or something. So I think that we're intuitively trying to be welcoming with it. But what I think you're really asking is, what does it mean to surveil a site where people are living, or surveil a site that people have rights to in some way? And I think that's really problematic. And the only like way through that I can think of is that, you know, maybe since our relationship to the university at Oregon is, you know, not really on the up and up, like what we tell them, or this is the way I think of it. Maybe Michael doesn't see it this way, but what we tell them we're doing is not really what we're really interested in. Like they've said, can you handle the BlackBerry? And what we're interested in is what kind of public program the production of Robinia might lead to. And, you know, maybe the programs that we're interested in are less about biking and, you know, like leisure experiences of that site, and more about, you know, affordances and, you know, physical cover, like barriers, privacy. So that isn't something that we've like decided, but I appreciate your question. I think it's hard.
Yeah, that's super interesting to think of what you're creating as something that actually prevents some kind of surveillance. Anyway, that's interesting. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. I just wanted to see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some opportunity for something a bit more oriented towards public engagement. So it's less of a purely sort of outside external thing, but something that allows for a dialogue with a constituency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, while these lazy bums are thinking about their questions, I'll go ahead and intervene. I'm really interested in this idea of kind of, I guess, what you call the micro land cover, right? And I don't know, I see some really interesting parallels with Earl Ellis's anthromes. The idea of sort of defining biomes, not purely as sort of the environmental ecological, but the sort of socio-ecological entanglement. And I feel like there's so much promise to also kind of think about your micro cover through a similar lens. And so I guess I'm a little curious about where you, which I know you spoke to a little bit, but where you see sort of the last work you showed going, and potentially how you see it potentially interacting with other sites beyond kind of your study site, with particularly on, I guess I'm interested in sort of marginal or vestigial sites that you might be able to reveal how, I don't know, little to no thought of maintenance and things have actually produced kind of revealing results through this new lens, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think, you know, to kind of state where we are with it, the kind of as a beginning to answer your question, I think we're trying to figure out, you know, what sort of forms we can produce on site by working in this way. So are we making kind of stands? Are we making rooms, or what are we doing? I think we're sort of yet to do that. One of the ways that we've tried to frame this in through kind of writing is in response to Elisa Iturbe's editing of one of the log journals, where she talks about carbon form, and she sort of describes the kind of tower, the glass tower, as inherently a carbon form, like one that doesn't exist without fossil fuel production. And so in that way, she describes the tower itself, as a carbon form. And we've tried to make an analogy or tried to kind of extend that to the landscape. What is a kind of carbon form in the landscape? And have made an analogy between the tree and the lawn. So, you know, the lawn as something that sort of requires carbon usage. in order to sort of basically do nothing, or the tree, which is considered, the kind of savior of climate change in a way, and that you could, by producing forests, you could start to, normalize climate change in some way. And we looked at a series of studies, not by us, and I'm sorry that I can't recall them at the moment, but basically talking about the problem of planting new forests, that these are forests which are like produced in a nursery on broad scale and then applied to places like you might see from the land cover study that are open to receiving forests. And what's happening is that you're getting something like, and I'm not going to get the numbers right, but it's something like 70% loss as a result of the kind of shock that happens in the tree from going from nursery to site. And the problem with the number of trees needed being at a scale where kind of careful maintenance isn't possible. And so, through in an extension of Michael and Julian's work, Michael kind of working on mowing tactics, we're wondering if we might be able to think of the lawn not as something that gets like stopped, but something that's a field where a forest could be curated out of through selective maintenance in the way that we are kind of identifying the Robinia. And if we can produce through maintenance and through growth forests, that maybe that's a better approach to that. So I think, to get back to your question about cover and marginal sites, I think that my understanding is that the traditional approach to forestation is about identifying large contiguous pieces of land that are available to be planted for forests. But as I think Michael's site shows, the kind of fragmented or marginal sites that aren't being watched, aren't being carefully aren't within a jurisdiction where they're being carefully managed. I think maybe those are opportunities to produce forests through this other way. So I don't know, I feel like I've answered that question with a kind of boomerang. I'm not sure if I got to it or if I escaped
No,
it.
I think that's sufficient. Thank you. Any other questions?
If not, if there aren't questions, or if I can like provide some subterfuge while somebody thinks of a question. Hi, Lucia, how are you? It's wonderful to see your home in the background. Hi, Peter. Good to see you. Hello, Robin. Can't see you, but I thank you for being here. Hello.
It's great to see you, Brian.
Oh, Peter, I think you're talking, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, Peter, you're muted.
Good. I'm interested in when they want to eliminate the blackberries and sustain the black locust, I suppose. What happens if certain cuttings allow the blackberries to thrive as walls or something, indeed as tall as you can, and maybe only 4 feet wide? So groups of people who are camping out there could go at berry time and eat them, along with, in other words, using that system not just to eliminate one, but to sustain both in different kind of stripes, let's say, and what that might mean, because there is some value to blackberries, I suppose, and making them into jam and all that. Lucia knows more about that than I, but I pick every possible berry that tries to endure around here in North Garden. So can you, as part of an experiment, make a mistake and actually don't cut away those berries and see what happens in 3 to 5 years as the black locusts grow beautifully?
Yeah.
If that might be a strategy of embracing the enemy, something.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. And then there are sort of 2 elements on the site working together with each other. And I think one thing that we've talked about is how we might maybe like stop the maintenance person from mowing a certain area by producing barricades of some sort. So that is maybe a way, opens the door to adding other materials on site, which like a bollard or something to be straightforward about it, that would cause the mower to move around it, but might also provide a scaffold for the BlackBerry. But now I can envision walls all over the site. So thank you for that.
All right, thank you.
And buckets of jam, right?
And buckets of
right.
jam. Yeah.
I also know, not to prolong this, but I've been to Eugene several times in the 80s and 90s, and I think what grows there amazingly was part of the, let's say, the atmosphere there is there's a lot of marijuana that could grow actually in these kinds of fields nearby. And so I wonder if there's a third plant that colors the process. So you can go on with trying
Cash crop.
cash crop and
Yeah, and that's one of the primary uses of the multispectral imaging, because they can fly over and easily detect the marijuana in fields, even if the marijuana has forest cover. So I think that's also fitting.
Is that because it's healthier, or how's it easy to sort of decipher the marijuana?
I think that they have different plants have different heat signatures.
Yeah.
Is my understanding. And so they just kind of like train their camera to see particular heat signatures. And one thing that they have to do with the cameras is they also need a sensor near the camera, which is collecting information about the available ambient light, because cloud cover will change the general temperature range. So I think that's their way of matching one image to another and being able to always identify one heat signature out of a field of other heat signatures.
Interesting. Or yeah, smoke particulates in the air or something.
Yeah, right.
You wonder how much does one of those multispectral imaging sensors cost? That'd be great to sort of attach to our drone here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't
think they're cheap.
I don't know exactly. I know that I try not to listen when Michael tells me about the numbers.
Well, he's got a grant funding it, so it works out. Looks like there's. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say he collaborates with a city and regional planning faculty member who is interested in GIS.
Cool. So maybe for the last question, we have one in the chat. Do you have any writing or resources about the idea of curating forests through selective maintenance?
I don't exactly. I mean, what comes to mind is Julian's work. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't. I do know of more kind of scientific-based studies that are, trying to kind of disprove the idea of reforestation, or not disprove the idea of reforestation, but to disprove the methods that it's currently being approached by talking about loss. And I'm happy to share that study.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few arguments actually that kind of paint a less rosy picture for reforestation, how it's not a silver bullet. It seems like such a great strategy. So wholesome.
Yes, it is wholesome.
All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Brian. I mean, it's really wonderful to see this work. And I mean, not only I think nostalgic for you to kind of show some of your UVA material, but it was nice to see Milton a few years prior and kind of see what you guys were up to there. Actually, I'm sorry, I have one little minor question. The control burn how was that sort of I don't know, executed? Did you have? I don't know what my question is exactly, other than that.
Did we ask for permission? Is your question?
Basically, yeah. Or did you guys sort of study this, or just kind of go out there with the blowtorch?
No, this group, they studied how to do it safely. I think that they did have a kind of a forest management person close to the family. They kind of asked for advice and they planned it with great detail. They then did not ask for permission from anyone. They kind of were hoping to apologize after the fact. But
I think that's what Milton is great for, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. Wonderful work. And I hope we can keep in touch.
I hope so too. Thanks so much for having me. Great to see all of you.
Wonderful to
Talk to
see
you
you.
soon.
Have
Take
a
care.
Good evening or good
Yeah.
afternoon, I should say, Brian.
Yeah, that's right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.